May I formally welcome everybody, really. It's wonderful to have you tonight as we together explore the history of Asian Pacific Americans in Riverside. My name is Susie Ling, and I'll serve as moderator for our program. My behind-the-scenes partner today is Dr. Laureen Hom of Cal Poly Pomona. She's our tech expert, and I just wanted to shout out a big thanks to her. I really do like looking at all your faces, but for tech reasons, it's better if we all shut off our video cameras for the most part. We will leave the chat function on if you'd like to add comments or ask questions. Tonight is really special because this is the coming together of many Asian American historical society. It has always been our strength in Asian Americana that there is much crossover between grassroots historical societies and Asian American studies programs in academia. I am very proud of our ongoing collaboration. However, we need to continue to build interethnic connections as we have much to learn from each other. Tonight, we build on both of these concerns. We will begin by allowing our sponsoring friends to introduce themselves. The first group up will be the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, whose president is Susan Dixon. Susan Dixon was a teacher at Castellara Elementary, and the Historical Society, had its first meeting in 1976 in the basement of the Cafe Bank in LA Chinatown. Go ahead, Susan.
So those initial people, their vision was to research the history of the Chinese in America, document, record, and make that known. It's very fitting that we would have our monthly meeting in concert with those from Riverside, because CHSSC has had a long time connection. CHSSC member Dr. Paul Chase was involved with the excavation and interpretation of the Riverside Chinatown archaeological excavation from 1984 to 1986. Our own Eugene Moy has a long time involvement with the Save Our Chinatown Committee. Save Our Chinatown Committee and the Historical Society are partners in the digitization of the Chinese exclusion files that are located in the National Archives in Riverside. And then in 2021, Historical Society hosted UCR interns who were studying in the Public History Department under Kathy Gudis. They worked for 2 quarters on researching history for this 5 Chinatown book. So I'd like to also introduce Mike Okamura. He's the president of the Little Tokyo Historical Society.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone. Tonight's program promises to be one of celebration. The timing is a little off, but as you know, May was the month of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but I think we should celebrate our proud cultures throughout the year, and I know we do. So LTHS was started in 2006 by icon Bill Watanabe, who was at that time the executive director of the Little Tokyo Service Center. And he, along with several other concerned residents and just people of interest of Little Tokyo, felt that they needed to create an organization because Little Tokyo was going through some gentrification at that time, and it continues to do so. So 2006, to fast forward 2022, we're a small but very mighty nonprofit all-volunteer organization. In fact, about 10 days ago, we just celebrated a new signage by the city of LA and a new plaque that tells the story of the Kame restaurant, the first Japanese-owned restaurant in Little Tokyo in 1884. So this plaque and city sign is now attached to the Bunkado gift shop because that's the same location where Kame restaurant was. And just the other day, we partnered with our friends in Boyle Heights. We did a walking tour to see one of the stanchions. There are 15 stanchions by the Angels Walk LA project, and this one is entitled Japanese Boyle Heights, which does celebrate the rich heritage and history of all the diversity that was once Boyle Heights. So if you're ever in Boyle Heights, please take a look at that stanchion at First Street between Breed Street and Chicago Street. So Little Tokyo Historic Society is very active and involved in so many different projects. We do have our monthly general meeting this Saturday, June the 4th at 10 a.m. via Zoom. If you are interested, please send me an inquiry in the chat and I'll respond to you. So at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Mike Manalo. He is the president of the Filipino American National Historical Society, the Orange County and Inland Empire chapter, and he's also the associate dean and director of the Asian American Resource Center at Pomona College. The Historical Society was established in 1982, and Orange County Inland Empire chapter, which is one of 30 chapters, was established in 2020. Take it away, Mike.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And welcome everyone to our presentation today. Thank you, Susie and the Chinese Historical Society for organizing this wonderful panel that we have today. I'm excited to learn about the solidarity and the tapestry of our historical region here. So just a little bit about FONS. As Mike had mentioned, we were created nationally in 1982 by the late, great Fred Cordova and also Manang Dorothy Cordova, who really set the foundation for Filipino American studies and Filipino American history at the national level. And so after many decades, we really took the lead of the two of those folks and many community organizers. And this was during the pandemic. We wanted to create our own chapter out here in the OC and IE in 2020, right? There was a lot of energy to organize and to learn about Filipino history. One of the things that we noticed and we realized was that this region is one of the largest regions of Filipino Americans outside of Manila. And we had to capture that electricity and a lot of those stories. And so what we do as a chapter is we focus on a couple things, Filipino American History Month, which is in October. We focus on research facilitation. So one of our ultimate goals is to create a History of Filipinos book in the Inland Empire, Orange County. We do community engagement, community outreach work. And finally, one of our projects is the oral history archival work. And I'm really excited for that project as we are creating a Filipino American archive at the Claremont College's library. And so that is a project that's ongoing and happening. If you're interested, please, I'll drop the email there. We would love to connect, or if you want to learn more about us. But yeah, that's a little bit about FONS OCIE. And again, we're very proud and humbled to be part of this presentation. And I'm going to give a shout out to our member, Joe Virata, who is going to present today. Right. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off back to Susie.
Thank you, Mike. Mike and Susan and Susie, right? I mean, really? Okay. We also have the Young Ok Kim Korean American Studies program at UC Riverside. And I'm going to let Dr. Edward Chang introduce that a little later when he gets the floor. So let's get started. Our first speaker today is Judy Lee. Judy Lee is a librarian at UC Riverside since 1980, and she is a founding member of Riverside Save Our Chinatown Committee, a member of the Multicultural Council of Riverside Museum, and also on the board of the Virata House. Judy?
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can get my screen share working. Great, so that's started. There we go. Does everybody have my slides on the screen? I hope so. Riverside was founded in 1870, some 20 years after the gold rush and after California achieved statehood. The Chinese came to Riverside and helped to shape the region's economic development. That effort was successful, so much so that in 1893, Riverside was named the richest city per capita, and much of which was due to the booming citrus industry. The Chinese and their prior experience with citrus played a major role in contributions to the Inland Empire citrus industry. And the Inland Empire is Riverside and the larger surrounding region. In fact, the current California Citrus State Historic Park is located in Riverside. The Chinese in Riverside came from all over China, but like many of the immigrants of that period, the majority came from the Sayup regions of Guangdong province. And many in the Riverside region came from Gombin village, highlighted on the map in red, enough so that Riverside's Chinatown was nicknamed Little Gombin. So let's meet a few of Riverside's Chinese pioneers. I'd like to start with Riverside Chinatown's last resident, Wang Huolun, also known as George Wang. George was born in 1900 and he passed away in 1974. So in the photos that you see here, there's a young George in his 1914 application for entry into the United States from the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA. And then next you see his high school graduation photo. And adjacent to that is the Riverside newspaper, the Press Enterprise photo, celebrating the 1968 Riverside County Historical Landmark Celebration, denoting Chinatown, Riverside's Chinatown, as a county landmark. That 10-foot high landmark sign disappeared and nobody knows where it went. The Save Our Chinatown Committee held its first Qingming as a private ceremony at George's Evergreen Cemetery gravesite. Now, his gravesite is located on a slight incline that overlooks his beloved Chinatown. George held a variety of jobs in Riverside and was a very colorful character. I'd like to think of him as a caretaker, an oral historian, and storyteller of Chinatown itself, as well as its inhabitants. The 1984-85 mitigated Riverside Chinatown archaeological dig and its report were named after him, Wang Huolun, an American Chinatown. And I'd like to give a shout out and a heartfelt thank you to the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California for its longtime support of Riverside's Chinatown. There are many stories involving George, but we have no time for them today. So on to our next pioneer. This is Wang Bin-zhou, who is a truck farmer, a vegetable peddler, and the father of Wang Huolun. He was born in 1873 and he died in 1929. Known locally as Little Joe, he was one of the last vegetable peddlers and very popular. So the photo of this Chinese vegetable peddler is from, around 1890, and it's not necessarily Little Joe in the photo. The larger photo that you see is also from that 1914 NARA file petitioning for his son's entry into the United States. Now, Save Our Chinatown Committee used the photo of an older Wang Bin-zhou at his unmarked gravesite in Olivewood Cemetery for our Qingming ceremony. And by the way, the Qingming is a grave cleaning or tombstone sweeping ceremony that's held annually. It turns out that Olivewood Cemetery houses the graves of many of Riverside's Chinese pioneers. So, for example, these two house servants, Ah Yum and Jim Ah, were close friends and they are buried side by side. They had worked for many years for different families respectively, and they were beloved by those families. The remembrances and epitaphs that you see on the gravestones were contributed by their American employers. And you might want to compare that to some of the headstones in Olivewood that are in Chinese. This Chinese headstone is that of merchant Wang Sai-chok. And he arrived in California from Gombin about 1890. Wang Sai-chok owned a general store in Redlands for quite a period of time before he opened a Riverside grocery store that was in business from about 1910 until his death in 1915. And although we do not have a photo of Wang Sai-chok, we can see some of his family. We do not know who the boy is that's on the left of that photo. And George is on the right, and his arms are around Wang Sai-chuk's children. They are Richard Wang, Helen Wang, and George Wang, who is no relation to Wang Huolun, George Wang. Families were scarce due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, so it was nice to see this photo. George himself had estimated that there were only about a half dozen women in Riverside's Chinatown in the 1920s. And George, when he arrived in the United States to Riverside's Chinatown, he arrived at a time when its population was kind of at its height and was starting to decline. I don't have my timer going, so I think I'm probably at time. And I want to just kind of go through the next couple of slides in page 2, because I want to give my colleague, Rosalind Sagara, a chance to do her part of the presentation. So Rosalind, you're on.
Well, let me introduce Rosalind formally. Thank you so much, Judy. There is so much good information. Rosalind is a public and architectural historian. She did her undergrad at UCR, and she's now the neighborhood outreach manager with the Los Angeles Conservancy. She is also a co-founder of Save Our Chinatown Committee, and she's also on the board of the Asian, and this is important. Judy, you have to stop sharing.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Here we go.
Rosalind is also on the board of this agency now called the Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. Go ahead, Rosalind.
Thanks, Susie. Judy, can you pull up the presentation again?
Yep, I was hoping to not have to do that, but. Okay, is it back on?
Yes, thanks. So in 2016, I was fortunate to be involved in authoring a citywide historic context statement, which essentially provides a framework for understanding the settlement and development patterns of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans in Riverside. This research identified key contributions, experiences, and notable members of the Chinese community, many of which Judy shared brief stories about. This research continues to serve as a guiding planning document for the city, and we see studies like these now being done in other cities, notably in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Ongoing research of the Chinese Exclusion Act case files at the National Archives in Riverside have provided a greater understanding of Riverside's early Chinese pioneers. Here we have Wang Yi, who was a gardener. We learned that he leased 80 acres near Riverside's Chinatown by the Santa Ana River in 1897. He had 12 investment partners and produced enough vegetables to send out 4 wagons of produce for sale daily. He had ties to a business identified as Sam Sing Lung Ki and Company, which was, according to the records, located across the street from the Garnier building in Los Angeles, further helping to affirm the links between Southern California's Chinatown communities. Next slide. Can you move the slide, Judy?
I'm trying to. Oops, sorry.
Oh, there you go. Thanks. So a bit more about the Save Our Chinatown Committee. We were formed in 2008 in response to a proposed development that, if built, would have destroyed Riverside's Chinatown archaeological site, which has been designated by all 4 levels of government. In addition to participating in city hearings and taking legal action to preserve the Chinatown site, we have also focused on sharing our community's history and culture to engage and grow our base of support. SOCC revived the local Qingming tradition, which Judy previously mentioned, an annual grave sweeping ceremony that had been lost locally due to the decline of Chinatown and the broader Chinese American population by the 1940s. Individual families would have continue these observances, but it wasn't done in mass, I guess, or a lot once the Chinatown community had dwindled. The Save Our Chinatown Committee revived this tradition in 2009. And unfortunately, due to COVID, we halted all public programming, though some members of our organization continued the tradition during the pandemic. We hope to relaunch our public ceremony next year. And when possible, we strive to include historic places in our programming. In partnership with the local JACL chapter and the Young Oak Kim Center, we launched Riverside Asian American Walking Tour program in 2017. The middle photo shows one of these tours. We also aim to cultivate a spirit of stewardship and community through programs such as our quarterly street cleanup. And here we are, we've adopted the streets that are adjacent to the Chinatown property. While SOCC's efforts to preserve Chinatown began in 2008, we see our work as part of a legacy of preservation that dates back to Riverside's early Chinese pioneers, and most notably George Wong, who fiercely protected the site while he was alive, but also includes members of the Historical Society who have long been involved in our preservation project. In the last year, we have been approached with 2 separate development proposals for the Chinatown site, both of which do not include preservation and we do not support. This speaks to the need to continue to educate the community about the value of preserving the heritage site. Next slide. Our preservation includes the creation of a public heritage park that preserves the archaeological resource and helps share the story of Riverside's Chinese pioneers with the public. To this end, we have re-engaged with the current owners of the property, the Riverside County Office of Education, to discuss how we might partner to bring this vision to reality. We are concerned that recent changes to the Surplus Land Act may impact the community's ability to realize the vision for long-term site preservation. We hope to have clarity and provide an update soon. For those who are interested in learning more about our work and supporting our efforts, please go to our website. Thank you very much for inviting us to present this kind of slice of Riverside's Chinese history. Judy, if you could go to the next slide. This is our contact information, and Judy has graciously put together a selected bibliography for Riverside Chinatown, and we'll provide the link in the chat for everyone who's attending. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rosalind. So there's so much, both on the preservation of the history as well as the sort of understanding of the individuals and the people that were involved in the building of the communities. Our next speaker is Dr. Kristin Hayashi. Dr. Kristin Hayashi is a board member of the Little Tokyo Historical Society. She is a graduate of the UCR PhD program and is also the Director of Collections, Management, and Access and Curator, I'm sure I said that wrong, at the Japanese American National Museum in Little Tokyo. Kristin?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Susie, for that introduction. I've been asked to share a little bit about the history of Japanese Americans in Riverside. And so this is going to be a very condensed history, but there are actually quite a few history makers in Riverside that I just wanted to highlight. Judy gave sort of a really good overview of Riverside's history. So Japanese started to populate Riverside shortly after the Chinese Exclusion Act, actually, in 1882. So it's by the 1890s that you have a few Japanese settling in Riverside, but the majority of them actually came after 1900. In the 1890s, you had a few businesses that started to pop up in the downtown area in Riverside. There was a grocery store operated by the Kumaru brothers, and 5 years later, in 1895, There was also an American style restaurant that Isokichi Izawa was the proprietor of. And additionally, a few Japanese businessmen in the area began to act as labor contractors to negotiate labor contracts between Japanese laborers and local citrus growers. So immigration patterns of Japanese to the United States is very similar to like immigration to Riverside. I think the really important thing that I wanted to highlight here is that Japanese immigrants came for a variety of reasons, but I think specific to Riverside, a lot of them came for work opportunities. And another really important point to make is that Japanese laborers came to the United States legally, but because of discriminatory legislation, they were considered aliens and eligible for citizenship. They weren't eligible for citizenship until 1952, and this is going to play an important role as we sort of continue on. So I just want you to remember that. So many Japanese laborers were enticed to work in Riverside's booming citrus industry, as Judy sort of mentioned. At the end of the 19th century, Riverside became the richest city per capita, as she mentioned, in the United States, as a result of the orange gold that really flourished in the area. And so the Japanese population in Riverside increased quite a bit between 1900 and 1910. So in 1900, there were approximately 100 Japanese residents, and by 1910, that increased to over 750. Japanese laborers earned really good wages working in the citrus groves in Riverside in comparison to other regions of Southern California or California more broadly. In 1895, citrus pickers were earning between $3.50 and $4 a day, which was actually a pretty good wage. And Japanese laborers earned just as much as their white counterparts, which wasn't the case in a lot of other areas. This is a photo from JANM's collection that I think is really unique because it's showing laborers. These are Japanese laborers who are working for the Pullman Company. And this is around 1909. And so, as I mentioned, Japanese immigrants weren't eligible for naturalization. And so, it begs the question, like, who counts as a citizen and what are the rights and privileges that come along with citizenship? So seated in this photograph on the right, you see Ulysses S. Kaneko. He was an immigrant from Japan along with his wife, Chio, who you see seated as well, and their son Arthur. All of them immigrated from Japan, and they settled first in the Redlands area in the 1890s. And Ulysses purchased a small citrus grove there. What's really interesting is in 1896, Ulysses Kaneko was able to obtain naturalization. And as I mentioned, this was not the case for the majority of Japanese immigrants. But for some reason, Ulysses was successful in obtaining naturalization. And so this allowed him the rights and privileges to make additional business moves. He opened a restaurant in the Riverside area along with a hotel, and then opened or started a poultry farm in nearby Moreno. He gained significant visibility as a result of being a successful businessman. And through the contacts that he made, he was able to create ties between the Japanese business community and also the white business community. And I think perhaps most importantly, because he had the rights and privileges of a citizen, he was able to purchase land. And he did that for other Japanese immigrants who didn't have those same privileges. And so he really helped to increase social mobility for a lot of Japanese immigrants living in the Riverside area. So there were, the impacts of de jure and de facto discrimination, as well as racial prejudice that the Japanese immigrants to the Riverside area and beyond, faced. And you can see that in a variety of instances. We talked about immigration already, but also this impacted home. So here you see the Virata family. In 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law, and that prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship, so Japanese immigrants, from being able to purchase property. And so the loophole in this stringent law was that some Japanese immigrants purchased land in their American-born children's names. And this is what Jukichi Hirata did. Oops. So in 1915, Jukichi Hirata provided the funds to purchase the home at 356 Lemon Street in Riverside. He listed his 3 American-born children as owners on the deed, and he was very careful to leave his name off off of the deed in compliance with the recently passed alien land law, which prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship from being able to own property. So of course, concerned white neighbors and then in that neighborhood on Lemon Street were really alarmed at the thought of Japanese families in their racially homogenous neighborhood. And so they formed a concerned citizens group to contest the sale. There was an offer made to Jukichi to try to buy back the house from him. He paid $1,500 for this house and someone offered him $1,800, but he refused to sell. And so after several failed attempts at trying to get the Hiratas to vacate their house, the neighbors convinced the California Attorney General to file a lawsuit against Jukichi Hirata for violating the alien land law. So in 1916, the people of California versus Jukichi Hirata became the first court case in California to test the alien land law. And 2 years later, Judge Hugh Craig ruled in favor of Hirata, stating that Jukichi's children had the right to purchase property as a result of the 14th Amendment. And so, there were all these, mechanisms of discrimination intended to really hamper the social mobility of Japanese immigrants and their descendants. But the community persisted. And so here, this is a photograph of a picnic in 1929 at Riverside. And it just, it shows that there was this really flourishing community, Japanese community in Riverside before the war. There are also some really famous artists from Riverside. So one of them is Benji Okubo. Benji was born in 1904 in Riverside, and he lived there until 1928 when he moved to Los Angeles to attend the Otis Art Institute. And Benji was really good friends with Tyrus Wong. There are these stories of them hanging out at the Dragon's Den in Los Angeles. But this is a painting that Benji Okubo did while he was incarcerated at Heart Mountain, which was the concentration camp in Wyoming. It's a very surrealist, I think, depiction of what life was like at Heart Mountain. Here's some other paintings that he created before the war. I believe these are of his mother. And another famous artist is Benji's sister, younger sister, Mine Okubo. She was born in 1912, and she first started her higher education at Riverside Community College. She was there from 1930 to 1933 and went on to become the first former incarceree to publish a book-length memoir of the incarceration experience. And this was an illustrated memoir called Citizen 13660. And it was published in 1946, which is really incredible to think about because the incarceration was still a current event. It wasn't even recent history yet. If you haven't read Citizen 13660, I encourage you to pick up the book because I think it gives just a really good overview of just daily life in one of America's concentration camps. So Mine and her younger brother Toku were incarcerated at Topaz concentration camp in Utah. Here's just another illustration from Citizen 13660 that shows Mine and her brother Toku with their luggage tag with 13660. And then to loop back to the Hirata family. So here's Sumi Hirata, one of Jukichi's children. Sumi returned to her family's home in Riverside after the war. And what's really incredible is that, the home was sort of kept intact as it was, before the family left in 1942. And I think it's a really good example of a Japanese, immigrant home and what that looked like. If there's a fantastic book called The House on Lemon Street that gives not only a really good overview of the Hirata house and their story, the Hirata family story, but I think it just gives a really good overview of the history of Riverside. So Mark Rauch, who's the author of the book, was really integral in helping to get the story documented. And the Hirata House is not only a local City of Riverside landmark, but it's also on the National Register of Historic Places and has the highest distinction, which is a National Historic Landmark, which it received in 1990. And that's really important because there's so few historic landmarks that represent the Asian American experience. And so the Hirata House and the family's collections are stewarded by the Museum of Riverside. today. And there's an ongoing campaign to rehabilitate the infrastructure of the house and to also create an interpretive center so that, we could learn more about this really important civil rights story of Riverside. If you're also interested in more about like the history of Japanese Americans in Riverside, the history department at UCR a few years ago created a really great walking and driving tour of sites throughout Riverside that helped to tell the Japanese American experience there. So I will pass it back to Susie.
Thank you so much, Kristin. That's really exciting. The Chinese and then the Japanese sort of formed many cheap labor sources for the various industries in Riverside. Another ethnic group that was pulled in, of course, were the Filipino Americans. Our speaker from the Filipino American National Historical Society, Orange County and Inland Empire chapter is Joe Virata. Joe Virata recently retired as the Dean of Students at UC Riverside after 24 years there. And Joe is currently involved with visual communications, digital history collaboration. Hey, Joe.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for including me on the panel. Let me check, is the volume of my mic okay? We were having some issues with it a little bit earlier. Okay, perfect. I want to express my appreciation and thanks to everybody for including me on this panel. I am not a professional historian. I am not an academic, but I am very excited to share and present a little bit of what I know or what I've discovered about the Filipino American experience in Riverside. Is everyone able to see my screen now? Perfect. I am going to do my best.
Sorry, Joe, no screen yet.
Oh, no screen. Let me. Hang on one second, folks.
I'll take this moment to encourage people to chat some questions. Joe, it's coming in.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to cut off people before they started asking questions. Susie, I invite you to feel free to hook me and reel me in. I tend to be long-winded sometimes, and so feel free to let me know that I'm going too long. But I did reach back quite a few hundred years to prepare this presentation. In fact, I was pulling slides out of the deck even in the few moments before we started meeting here. So let me go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to express my appreciation to the Filipino American National Historical Society, in particular the Orange County and Inland Empire chapter, the Museum of Riverside that provided a lot of the resource material that I was able to take a look at and incorporate. Kristin Hayashi, although I haven't seen him in decades, he did a lot of the research that can be found on the Asian American Riverside website, which Deborah Wong has put together. And so I thank Deborah Wong as well for publishing and maintaining that website. Finally, I wanted to express my gratitude to Royal Morales, who was the instructor for the Filipino American Experience courses at UCLA, Cal State LA, USC, multiple colleges and universities throughout Southern California. It's his framework that has always stuck with me and that I'll be kind of adapting to the presentation tonight. And so even though I'm not going back as far as I thought I was going to, I am going back a couple of hundred years to the expedition of Juan Bautista de Anza. And I go there because by the time de Anza started his expeditions, his goal was to get up here to Monterey and San Francisco to start settlements. But by the time he came around to do that, the Manila galleon trade had already been in full effect for 200 years. That is the trade route that goes from Manila to Acapulco, which is down in the lower corner of this map. The ships used in that galleon trade, many of them were built in the Philippines, and they were sailed by Filipino sailors. And so over those 200 years, sailing across the Pacific twice a year, it's inevitable that at some point along the route, Filipinos stayed for a while. They stopped for a while. And this, along the dotted line here, is where De Anza recruited members of his expedition. And so I'm asserting, I have no documentation for this, but I'm asserting that it is possible that Filipinos were included within that group of people, that expedition that went up through the Texas, Arizona, New Mexico area, in through California, and up through this area here where De Anza settled or spent the night and then crossed the Santa Ana River. What he found was a place that he named the Valle de Paraíso, the Valley of Paradise, or Paradise Valley. It's a place that had already been occupied by the Cahuilla, the Tongva, the Luiseño, the Serrano peoples. And so it wasn't a brand new discovery, but it did take note in his journals. He did make a note in his journals that it was a great place for raising horses and cattle, a beautiful place to turn into farmland at some point. Ultimately, the Valle de Paraíso was where Riverside was established. And this, down here at the bottom, this is the Santa Ana River. And so, yes, Susie, there is a river in Riverside, and we're happy to have it as part of our community experience there. I'm going to fast forward to 100 years to the establishment of Riverside and talk a little bit about the context that was going on there. In 1870, in the late 19th century, the United States was on the edge of expansion. Here in Riverside, you can see that there were buildings being raised. There was a city being born. Down in this photograph here are some of the wagons used for the orange industry. As some of our previous speakers had already mentioned, the oranges, the navel orange in particular, was found to grow very well here. And it was the first place that we had a commercial grade product, citrus product, that has its roots right here in the Riverside community. By the time the turn of the century came around the 1900s, the United States had already taken over the Philippines. In 1898, the United States had acquired the Philippine Islands and had clearly established itself as a world power, as a colonial power. And so part of what they wanted to do as they asserted their presence amongst the locals was to demonstrate their benevolence. And so they created this program, along in partnership with the government of the Philippines, the local leadership, I should say. They created the Pensionado program, which was an opportunity to provide a scholarship, so to speak, for Filipino youth to come to the United States and study and be introduced to American institutions. The idea was, let's help them learn about democracy. Let's help them learn about our cultural and our educational system so that they can return to the Philippines and help uplift that nation to a place where we think it needs to be. And so the pensionados came. Most of them were from elite families in the Philippines. They came to the United States. The first class that came over in 1903 was 100 pensionados. And out of that 100, 14 of them came to Riverside. That's huge. That's a giant percentage of students that came from the Philippines to Riverside. And it was a big deal. It was a huge, exciting thing for a lot of the society of Riverside. And so these 14 students were often invited out to dinners and to receptions and to welcome events. They were presented with opportunities to perform on their musical instruments, to talk about their homes, to do some writing, to be included in local newspapers. And they were just given a fantastic welcome by the people of the Riverside community, because it was our intent to make them feel like the experience here in the United States was a positive one, and that when they go back to the Philippines, they would want to emulate that experience in the government. It was an interesting time because at the same time that the pensionados were here, they had been educated under Americans, but they were also very well aware of the independence struggle that the Philippines had had against the Spaniards, as well as the war that they had fought against the Americans. And so the idea of independence was still strong in a lot of them. And there was a little bit of bittersweetness when the Americans started talking about Independence Day and celebrating the 4th of July. And here are these Filipino students who found the irony very apparent in the experience that they were doing, that they were having there. One of the things that was a part of the backdrop of the experience that these Filipinos were having was the idea of manifest destiny, because the United States at that time had just acquired several colonies. The Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba were all areas of land that the United States was asserting its authority and its presence in, with the idea that through benevolent assimilation, they could lift up the uncivilized and recreate them in the image of Uncle Sam and the Americans. And so, that was sort of the undercurrent of the experience that the pensionados were having. Overall, though, by most accounts, the pensionados enjoyed their time in the United States, but there was a bittersweet memory that became a part of their experience about a year later. Due to this manifest destiny and the benevolent assimilation aspect, the St. Louis World's Fair was a part of their experience. Many of these Filipino pensionados went to the World's Fair, where one of the exhibits that they encountered there were the human zoos, including an exhibit of Filipinos. This goes hand in hand with the idea that the Americans were trying to perpetuate, that it was our responsibility as an enlightened people to lift up and enlighten the world around us. And the human zoos demonstrated the inferiority of a lot of these other communities, other cultures. I'm going to jump ahead now because I know I'm crunching time here. And we're going to go to the 1930s. We've heard a lot already about the need for labor. Filipinos were a part of that experience there. Oops, let me see here. From 1917 to 1934, Filipinos were classified as U.S. nationals, and so they were able to migrate to the United States without the same kind of restrictions other Asian communities had. And so they were brought in to fill the labor needs that agriculture in particular was having. In Riverside, that meant oranges. That meant orange picking. But they had a very different kind of reception than the pensionados. And I'll go ahead and read an excerpt of this article that was published in the Riverside Enterprise that sort of describes the reaction that a lot of folks had to this notion that Filipinos were being brought to Riverside. At a time when more than 300 jobless white men have registered on Mayor Joseph Long's list of unemployed and are glad to get work for 3 days a week digging ditches, a group of 50 to 60 Filipinos has been imported to Riverside District to pick oranges. The Filipinos, crowded 6 or 7 to a room, are housed in a court of cottages at 2510 10th Street and expect to go to work on December 1st in groves near the city, according to Alfonso de Dios, a Filipino labor contractor. Dios brought the group to Riverside some 3 weeks ago and had obtained quarters for them pending the beginning of the orange picking season. And that was fairly typical, that there was this resistance, there was this animosity, this hostility towards the Filipinos. And yet they persisted. They traveled throughout the Inland Empire, or the inland communities as we call them, throughout Indio, to El Centro, to San Bernardino, to Calpatria and Holtville, and of course Riverside. There they picked peas, pears, oranges, And of course, they picked grapes because grapes would come to figure quite prominently in the Filipino American experience, as well as the Riverside experience in general. By 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act had facilitated Philippine independence from the Americans, but it also placed restrictions on new immigration to from the Philippines to the United States. And so what we had was a generation of people who were already here, the Manongs, who were getting older. They were still traveling. They were still driving around, following the crops and following the fields, working as hard as they could to make a good living, sending money back home, organizing when they could to get better conditions and better wages, but oftentimes finding resistance from the locals as well as from the growers. By 1965, the Coachella grape strike became a part of the Filipino American experience, as the Filipinos, under the organizing efforts of Larry Itliong and Pete Velasco of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, began organizing folks in Coachella, grape workers in Coachella, to go out on strike. What they wanted was to be paid at least as much as the Mexican farm workers who were a part of the Bracero program. They wanted to go from, I think, $1.10 per hour up to, $1.25 per hour up to $1.40 per hour. And they wanted a contract that provided them with some level of benefit and some level of security. Well, they won the strike in Coachella, but they didn't win a contract. They won the wages, but they didn't win a contract. But what it did do was it set them, positioned them well for moving the strike up to a place called Delano, where many of you are more familiar with the 1965 grape strike that started in Delano. These are photographs of Pete Velasco and Larry Itliong, the leaders of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee and the Filipinos who went out on strike in Coachella. Now I want to kind of go back a little bit. I'm rushing through a lot of this. I apologize. And talk a little bit about the Filipinos in the military, because that was another avenue for the Filipino migration to the United States in general and to the Riverside area in particular. It was the U.S. Bases Agreement in the 1940s, 1947, that established a lease for the United States to have military bases in the Philippines, but also allowed Filipinos to join the military and come to the United States as soldiers and sailors. It allowed them to bring their families with them. And so that's when you began to see the Filipino community changing a little bit. Communities started popping up, whereas prior to this, it was pretty much a bachelor itinerant society, kind of following the crops, following the places where the work was going. But with the military, you started seeing communities growing up in places like Riverside and San Bernardino. We have a multiplicity of military facilities out here, each one kind of expanding communities. We've got March airfields, 29 Palms, Edwards Airfield in the local areas. We've got great proximity to San Diego, Oceanside, San Pedro. And in each of these areas, we began to see Filipino communities expanding and growing. Not only the workers of the Filipinos, but also the families of the Filipinos. History is both an intellectual and academic pursuit, as well as a personal one. And so I wanted to share these photographs of my family. That's my dad on the left here, receiving his chief's cap in the Navy. And on the right is my family, my siblings, as we were growing up in San Diego. This little dude on the left here would grow up to be the articulate, charming, and handsome person presenting to you right now, although he is a bit long-winded. Have I run out of time already, Susie? We also have the nurses' experience. I'm going to go through these real quick. all the way back to 1915. And this goes back once again to the presence of the Americans in the Philippines. Americans had set up an American-style education in the Philippines, and that extended to the schools of nursing there. If you've ever wondered why there are so many Filipino nurses in the United States, it's because we were sort of predestined to be working in the United States. The nursing training, the medical training in the Philippines was geared towards responding to American-style medicine, American-style diseases, American-style ailments. And so that's what was going on with a lot of these folks who were coming through the nursing programs in the Philippines, including Mom. Hi, Mom. I'm making this all about me. Sorry about that, Susie. But these nurses came to the United States ready to work and found that because of the, where did it go? The exchange visitor program, that is not correct. Yes, it is. The exchange visitor program. Thousands of nurses from the Philippines over the years started coming to the United States as exchange visitors in order to take advantage, ostensibly, of the opportunity to learn about the United States, but oftentimes ended up settling into the communities, the Filipino communities that were being established here. I do want to highlight that history doesn't stay in the past, and that Filipino nurses continue to be an important part of our culture, of our society, particularly now in this era of the pandemic. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see it, I would encourage everybody to look for this documentary, Nurse Unseen, which focuses on the history and the humanity of Filipino nurses. It is a sad fact, that Filipinos make up only 4% of the nurses in the United States, but of all the nurses who have passed away due to COVID, a third of them are Filipina. A third of them, 31.5% of the nurses that pass away from COVID-19 are Filipina nurses. So I think that sort of informs the experience there. The final piece that I wanted to talk about was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. That's right down over here in this timeline I've been doing it. What it did was it abolished national origins quotas, and so larger numbers of people were able to migrate to the United States, not only from the Philippines, but from countries around the world. It created a preference system through which people could sponsor family members. So it was a way to reunite spouses, children, and parents, brothers and sisters. We were able to start sponsoring people to join the communities that were already established here. And it also created a preference for created opportunities for skilled and trained professionals to migrate to the United States. And so at this time in 1965, you began to see not only an increase in the population, an increase in the numbers, but you also began to see an increase in the diversity of occupations that they were pursuing. These weren't just laborers anymore. They weren't here to work in the fields and the farms. They weren't here to serve food in the galleys and the decks of the ships. They were here to pursue careers as technicians, as doctors, as architects, as engineers. What they experienced here is a whole nother level of presentation that I won't get into, but I think that we need to recognize that the community really began to explode at that time in 1965 and onward. What that meant for Riverside is that we have a population in Riverside of about 2.5 million people now. And so, since that's a exponential growth since the 1965 immigration reform. What it means for those of us in, well, let me back up 1 second here. Of that 2.5 million, about 6.5% are Asian American, and of that Asian American, about 40,000 are Filipino. So the 40,000 Filipinos here in Riverside are clustered in management positions, business, science, arts occupations. That's the type of work that we're doing. It's not just about working the fields, working the farms, or serving in the military. We've found ways forward in management, business, science, and the arts. The types of industries that we're clustered in tends to be education. 40% are clustered in educational services, healthcare. Healthcare, there's the big one, and the social assistance. So what does that mean here?
Joe,
Yes.
you are.
I am on my
Too
last slide,
much.
I swear. I swear I am wrapping it up right now. Okay, so sorry. Anyway, we're not always easily identified. There's no signature architectural style that gives away our presence. Our names are mixed in with our Latinx cousins and neighbors. You'll find us though. You'll find our businesses tucked into mini malls and suburban shopping plazas. You might pass by if you're not looking, if you're not paying attention. But slow down a bit. You'll see us there. Feeding your family, tending your wounds, changing the world. So many thanks to you all. Appreciate the indulgence. Maraming salamat po sa iyong lahat. Susie, it's back to you.
Thank you, Joe. I do think it's important to understand that Asian American history has tales, right? And we're still living proof. Mom, dad, you know, Inai and Ate, all of us are in the same continuum. My last speaker is Dr. Edward Chang, and I think it's so interesting because Dr. Edward Chang became a professor of ethnic studies at UC Riverside. He's very prolific. He's written about 12 books, and then very recently, it was meant to be, wasn't it, Ed, in that he discovered or came to know more about Pachapa Camp. So I'll let Ed talk about Pachapa Camp and also about his Young Ok Kim Center for Korean American Studies at UC Riverside.
Hello, everyone. Susie for organizing this wonderful kind of a Zoom conference. And yes, I'm not really a historian. I am more of a ethnic studies and sociologist, but this is accidental discovery, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint. And let me see from the beginning. And I call it Dosan's Republic and Pachapa Camp, the first Koreatown in the United States. And I'm going to skip this. And in 2017, City of Riverside designated Pachapa Camp as a point of cultural interest. And this statue of Dosan Ahn Changho, who founded, he was the leader of Pachapa Camp, was erected in 2001. But at the time, we did not know anything about Pachapa Camp. This photograph is one of the very exciting and very valuable historical photo of Dosan Ahn Changho picking oranges in Riverside. And we had an exhibit from October 16, 2021 to February 28, 2022. And at the Culver Center, the Museum of Photography at UCR, and I'm happy to report it generated the second highest major media press coverage in history of UCR arts, including PBS NewsHour, New York Times, LA Times, NBC News, and on and on. And so I have been very busy. This is a photo of a famous Korean American, eldest son of Dosan Ahn Changho, who is Philip Ahn. He's an actor. He's the first Asian American actor to receive Star and Walk of Fame in Hollywood Boulevard, and that's his mother. And you notice he's holding orange here, and this photo was taken in 1907. And this is a star of him. And the whole research project began around 2016 or 17. And this particular map produced by the Sanborn Insurance Company of New York in 1908. It shows the downtown Riverside, and it says Korean settlement. And I knew of this map. It was accidentally discovered by Korean American undergrad students at UCR in early 2000. But I really didn't, and that was the only thing available at the time, nothing else. By the way, Dosan Ahn Changho is one of the famous a leader of modern Korean history. There have been numerous books and articles, documentaries about him, but none of them mention anything about Riverside Korean American community. None. There was none. Around 2016, I decided maybe I should look into this. Maybe I could write an article. And the address is 1532 Pachapa Avenue. And during the process of the research project, I found out the address has changed. And by the way, after the PBS NewsHour, someone wrote me a letter, handwritten letter, this old gentleman. He said, after Korean immigrants moved out of Pachapa Camp in 1918, nearby Japanese Americans moved in. So I need to really verify whether that happened or not. Prior to Korean immigrants occupying Pachapa Camp, it was Chinese railroad construction workers in 1880. It was their residential, temporary place. So it has a long history from Chinese to Korean to Japanese, but I need to look into that. And this is one of the photographs. This is a gauge canal, and the Pachapa camp was located right next to Gauge Canal. And this photograph was taken in 1911, right after the convention. And this is another photograph from different angle. This is a Dosan Ahn Changho photographer taking photo of Korean immigrant community. So this is a Gauge Canal, obviously you can see. So it really shows kind of interesting thing. But one of the things that puzzled me at the time, beginning of my research project, was that Pachapa camp was family-based, women and children. And I said to myself, how is that possible? At the time, Chinatown was a bachelor society, Manila Town, bachelor society, and it was prior to Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. So it really didn't make any sense. But Ahn Changho devised a plan, and he devised a plan to send physically strong and experienced Koreans to Riverside so they can work and pick oranges. And once they do a good job, then they will hire other Korean immigrants. So he devised a plan. And the Pachapa camp is a shanty town. There was no electricity, no running water, and it was very poor living condition, right? So, it was just very, a shack. It was a shack. And one of the things that I am arguing is that it became kind of a first Korean settlement in the United States. And the question is, how is that possible? Korean immigrants arrived in Hawaii first, and later on in San Francisco. But how could you claim the Pachapa camp became the first Korean settlement? In Hawaii, once they arrived in Honolulu, they were scattered all over the different islands. And from different islands, they were scattered to different plantations. So they were residing in plantation until much later in 1907, 1908. Whereas in San Francisco, majority of Korean immigrants who arrived, they were living kind of an outskirt of Chinatown, not really forming one geographically defined community. Whereas in Pachapa camp, it was the family-based, and the community, Dosan's leadership, and he established the rules and regulations. And one of the things he did, first thing he did was establish Korean Labor Bureau. This is critical because, at the time, labor contracting was controlled and dominated by mostly Japanese American labor contractors. And the Korean immigrants were having a tough time getting a job. Once they established the Korean Labor Bureau, they were able to place Korean workers to different jobs, and the Korean immigrants began to arrive in Riverside. Once you go to Riverside, you can work, right? So they got, and he established many independent organizations in Riverside, and it was not really labor camp. It was a kind of a semi-permanent settlement where they had a wedding ceremony, birthday parties, and Korean mission and Korean school. And I don't have a time to really explain Hemet Valley incident, but in terms of the number, initially I thought the number was about 60 to 70, but I found out as of 1905, there were already 70 Koreans residing at Pachapa Camp. But this number excludes women and children. So if you add women and children, the number exceeds 100. In 2 years later, the number increased to 150. So if you include women and children, it could be over 200. And during the orange picking season, during the winter time, they were already recruiting for additional 100 or more laborers. So at the peak time, peak period, December, it could be about 300 or even more residing in Pachapa Camp working. And that's significant because at the time, the total population of Korean immigrants in mainland did not exceed 800 at the most. So, significant number were working, living in Pachapa Camp. I discovered this Korean newspaper. It was October 5th, 1910. And it confirmed my suspicion that Riverside is the first Koreatown in the United States. It corroborated my argument. And another book written by Dosan Ahn Changho, Golden Mountain, he said it has soon become the first largest Korean settlement in America, at least in the orange season of each year for a number of years. He also confirmed that it became the first Korean settlement. And this is another very important historical photograph. This is Ahn Changho, and this is multiracial labor force. Date is on looks like a Mexican workers here, looks like Eastern European looking workers, and it's somewhere between 1905 and somewhere in 1912. The date is unknown, but I am suspecting it might be around 1905, but I don't know. And this is another important discovery I made. This is Ahn Changho and his wife. This is a San Francisco Chronicle interviewing the couple shortly after they arrived in San Francisco. It was a full page. And they arrived in October 14, 1902. And this newspaper was printed December 7, 1902. In a month and a half later, San Francisco Chronicle published a full page about their arrival and why. And mostly they were interested in learning about Korea. You notice C, not K. And this is another very historic photograph of the Pachapa Camp. In 1911, they had the third Korean National Association of North America Convention. And in this convention, they passed 21 articles of governance. And I'm arguing that it became the basis for Shanghai-based Korean provisional government's adaptation of democratic republicanism. And they were already practicing democratic republicanism here in Riverside, Pachapa Camp. And you remember, Korea was ruled by king until 1910. Only 9 years later, they all of a sudden declared democratic republicanism. And no one knew how it came about. No Korean historian until now knew how that was possible. And I was able to trace how the Ahn Changho, under his leadership, established the separation of powers and ruled democratically here in Pachapa Camp, and became the basis for adapting democratic republicanism in 1919. And this is another confirmation by annual report of Board of Home Missions of a Presbyterian Church. He said, Riverside, another happy groups of Christians, somewhat distinguished from the other stations by the number of young wives and their children. Again, this is a very special place. And they were part of Riverside Calvary Presbyterian Church. I went there and found Korean membership list. I mean, this is just amazing. But to call it short, by 1918, the Pachapa Camp no longer exists, because in 1913, Riverside had a major setback with a deep freeze, and he devastated orange citrus industry, and many Korean families began to relocate to Dinuba, Ridley, Willows, the different California towns that barely maintained between 1913 and 1918. And finally, Riverside chapter closed in November 10, moved to 1158 Vine Street. And another important thing about Korean National Association is that it gave a full membership to women in 1918. You know, women's suffrage were granted in 1920 in the United States. But Ahn Changho, he was such an intellectual leader that granted full membership to Korean women to the Korean National Association in 1918, and they became very active. Anyway, Young Kim Center was established in 2010, named after late Colonel Young Kim, who served in 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Unit during World War II, because of his not only a war hero, but more importantly, he was a humanitarian activist, establishing numerous nonprofit organizations in Southern California, including Japanese American National Museum, right? He was part of that. And so I decided to name a research center after him. And I am giving full lecture this Sunday. I was invited by the La Crescenta Historical Society, and I'm giving a lecture at the Lanterman House, historic Lanterman House at 2 o'clock this Sunday. So if anyone is interested attending, you must register. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's so much to digest. Just to repeat, that's the La Crescenta Historical Society on Sunday at 2 o'clock. I have a couple of questions. I wondered if any of our panelists or anybody had heard of any Indian Americans or Desi Americans who were also working in the Riverside area. I know many of our attendees are very knowledgeable. So if anybody wants to raise their hand and then unmute to Dr. Chang, do you know anything about Indians? No?
No, I'm not.
That's interesting, yeah. No takers. But Dr. Chang sort of talked about the collaboration between Japanese and Koreans. And that's another wonderful story we'd like to explore one day, the collaboration between Latinos and Filipinos with the AWOC. And one wonders, you know, about Dosan Ahn Changho's relationship with other ethnic groups. Dr. Chang?
Yeah, I mean, one of my students, Taka, is working on the Virata House project, but he's also looking into relations between Korean immigrants and Japanese American community. They were nearby, right next to each other geographically. So there's a lot of possibility. I know Mary Peck Lee talked about how her family went to Chinatown to buy, you know, kind of pans and whatever necessary to cook for the man, right? Her mom did that. So there must be some interaction between, and there's the Inaba family. One of the last person who were born and raised and passed away a few years ago is Violet Catherine Kim. And her family was very close to Inaba family, Japanese American family. And so she became the caretaker of Violet Catherine Kim. So until she passed away, it was basically, she's the one who took care of her. So there's gotta be some kind of a, you know, relations, and we need to look into that a lot more.
Dr. Chang, there's a request for you to chat the Sunday details, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think you have to register but I don't have information right now. But maybe I will pull out the information and put it in the chat.
Thank you. You have a few minutes because I'm going to turn it over to Eugene Moy of the Chinese Historical Society, as well as William Gao at Cal State Sacramento. So Eugene, can you take it?
Hi, and wow, this is a lot of information and material to digest, and I'm really appreciative of all the speakers coming in. Actually, we do have questions coming on the chat, but maybe I'll let you take those, Susie. But I do want to welcome really all the people who have joined us today. We have a far-ranging crowd. I see that from Portland to New Jersey, and but I should make note of some special people, some of whom I haven't seen in a long time. We have the Honorable Mike Eng online listening, and he has been for a long time a supporter of the Riverside Day of Inclusion program every December. And Mike, nice to see your face here, and you're always welcome to join in some of the local discussions. I see Jan Lee Wong is participating, and his family, of course, ran the Chungking restaurant in Riverside, a historic restaurant, and so glad to see you. And hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon. We have some distinguished folks like Professor Kathy Gudis from UC Riverside, and a few others, including Paul Chase, who was the person who alerted the Chinese Historical Society and the community to the threat that existed to the Riverside Chinatown site in the early 1980s. That's 40 years ago. Paul, good to see you, and keep working at the biography that you're working on. Also, I want to maybe well, I'm going to close a little bit later, Susie. So maybe I'll let you take some of the questions right now, but I do have some comments a little bit later to close out.
I'm sorry, Eugene, I'm not getting the questions, so I can't read them at all. Sorry.
All right, well, let me see if I can read them in the chat here. Let's see.
I posted Sunday's event in the chat, so those of you interested, you may register.
Okay. I don't see questions. I just see a couple of comments. Any questions? Well, I actually had one for Professor Chang earlier today. And Chinese exclusion required Chinese immigrants to register and also to carry around an ID card with them. And had posed that question to you, if the Korean immigrants had to carry something like that, and maybe Kristin can respond too. Did Japanese immigrants have to carry IDs with them in order to avoid being thrown into jail or summarily?
Yeah, I did not see any ID card for Korean immigrants. In fact, many of them came and arrived in San Francisco without any documents because they were coming not from Korea, but from Shanghai, because Korea was colonized by Japan. So they arrived in San Francisco without any documents, and they were granted special exile status. So as long as the Korean National Association provide kind of a proof, this person, they are allowed to land in San Francisco. So they were known as a people without country. And so they were granted some special exile status for many Korean immigrants.
So it's interesting that with these various global migrations that we have a differential treatment of each group. So,
Yeah, that is directly related to Hemet Valley incident that I did not have a time to go into. That really triggered diplomatic conflict between US and Japan. And so small incident in Hemet Valley triggered the diplomatic conflict between Japan and the United States. And finally, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan declared Koreans in the United States are not Japanese subjects. They are Korean, and they will be represented by Korean National Association. And he resolved the diplomatic crisis. And so, in other words, Japan has no jurisdiction over Koreans in the United States.
So I know that this didn't come out necessarily, or maybe I didn't hear it earlier, but when Judy and Rosalind were talking about Chinatown, at the north end of Chinatown, there was a Chikongtong building, a temple, which was an association that hosted many visits in various communities across the West by Sun Yat-sen, by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, in his quest to raise funds for the overthrow of the Chang dynasty. So one could say that Riverside Chinatown was one of the places where that helped foster the Republican movement in China. Could we simplify? Maybe that's too easy to say, but it is Riverside, Koreatown, the sort of the birthplace for Korean independence?
Oh yeah, I published an article, proving that 21 articles of governance passed in 1911 convention. There's a lot of similarities, the language itself, with the democratic republicanism that declared by the Shanghai-based Korean provisional government. So I compare, and it's all based on separation of powers. Executive branch, legislative, and judicial branch. They clearly spell it out. So I'm arguing that the origins of a modern democracy in Korea began in Pachapa Camp. Yes,
that's amazing. So out of a small rural area like Riverside, this is where modern day Korea evolved from. A question for Kristin, with the Virata house, and of course with the Virata decision, which really affirmed birthright citizenship for children of immigrants. Have there been follow-up tests of that decision, or well, maybe of the 14th Amendment, obviously, but I'm just wondering, has there been a similar case that's been brought up before, let's say in other places, like in other states? I hope you're still on, Kristin. Maybe
I am, Eugene.
Okay.
Sorry, back to your question. You were showing, or you sent around some like ID cards, right? That you said that Chinese immigrants had to carry on them following the Chinese Exclusion Act. I've never seen that for Japanese immigrants. So even after 1924, after immigration was cut off, I've never seen that. So no ID cards until the indefinite leave cards, or actually there were work permits that were issued during the incarceration. But there was the registration. Every family had to register their family prior to the forced removal, but they weren't issued ID cards. They were issued, family numbers and tags. So in terms of, you're saying, like, were there other challenges to the alien land law?
Right. Maybe particularly against Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants. Were there other cases, like in, let's say, Washington State or Oregon, other places?
There were definitely challenges to the alien land law, certainly. And one project
this was a California case. because it went to the California Supreme Court, and I was wondering whether there were similar challenges in other places.
Yeah, well, a project that the Little Tokyo Historical Society has been working on is the Japanese hospital in Boyle Heights. And that was when 5 Japanese immigrant doctors, tried to incorporate a hospital in Boyle Heights in 1926, and they were denied, saying that they violated the alien land law. So again, they didn't have, the rights of citizens, but they took their case ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court. And won their case. But I'm sure there's so many, not so many, but many other cases in other states, because there were alien land laws in not just in California, but in the Pacific, Northwest as well. So
also in the Okubo family, almost every year that we have had a Qingming celebration in Riverside at Olive Wood Cemetery. The Chinese American graves are right next to the Japanese American graves, and we have noted that there is a marker for the mother of Benji in the Okubo there. Purportedly, that headstone, the calligraphy was written by Tyrus Wong, who I'll mention about a little bit later on. So
yeah, just say Minnie and Benji's mother was a Japanese immigrant. She was an artist who studied art in Japan before she immigrated. So she really encouraged, she was a calligrapher, but she encouraged her children to be artists. And so several of them did become artists, which I think is, is really neat.
Yeah,
So.
what's interesting is that some of them got out of camp for a while. Like Minnie, I guess she went to New York, and then therefore wasn't restricted. Did I hear a question in the background?
Gene,
Yeah.
Gene, I have a comment that was requested a while back, but I didn't have any way to signal that I had the comment on immigrants from India. Is it my turn?
Yeah, well, just keep going. Yeah, you're breaking up. This is Kevin Aiken.
Gene, is it my
board
turn?
member of the Save Our Chinatown Committee.
I don't know. Can anyone hear me?
We hear you. We hear you fine.
Okay, let me.
Signal is breaking up, Kevin. Signal is breaking up.
That's unfortunate. Will, do you want to go ahead and do your spiel? And we should be tying up. It's past our
I know.
slotted
I have a comment for Joe, by the way. There is plenty of evidence for the Filipino presence in the area. One of the newest 99 ranch markets in the area in South Riverside and Corona. If you go into that store, in addition to the usual food counters of Chinese and Thai and other food, there's also a Filipino food counter, and there's also a counter for mailing balikbayan boxes. So you can mail care packages to the Philippines. So there definitely is a presence. Kevin?
Okay, this is Kevin. I'm back on. May I say my 1 minute about Indian immigrants? In the 19-teens and 20s, there were quite a few people from the Punjab, almost all young men, who went to the Coachella Valley, both in Imperial County and Riverside County. And they were engaged in agriculture, some as farmers, some as farm workers, and some of them branched out into other things. One of them who branched out was a young man named Dalit Singh Sound, obviously of Sikh extraction. He was elected, later he was elected a justice of the peace, and then he was elected as a congressman representing Riverside and Imperial counties. D.S. Sound, who was elected in the mid-1950s, wrote a book, which is still available in libraries, called Congressman from India. So yes, there were definitely some Indian immigrants in Riverside and Imperial counties. I would note that there are a number of Mexican families, Mexican American families in the Coachella Valley area who didn't know until researchers turned up this fact that among their ancestors were some folks from India. They had been told that great grandpa was un indio, but they thought that meant he was Apache or Navajo or Hopi. They didn't realize it meant he was Sikh. There were a number of Sikhs who married local Mexican girls and gave rise to very large families who are well represented in the Coachella Valley today.
That's a good thing to raise. We actually at the Historical Society here have a video about the lives of Indian Mexican families, farmers who were in the Coachella and Imperial Valleys. I didn't really particularly mention that because it wasn't close to Riverside itself, but yes, it's really in the vicinity. So that's a good point to raise. I want to really pass this on to Will Gao for a moment to make an announcement before I close. Will, are you available?
I am here. Yes, thanks, Gene. So thanks everyone for coming to this wonderful panel. I had learned so much listening to all of you, and it's great to see some folks virtually that I hadn't seen in quite a while. I am Will Gao. I'm a assistant professor at Sacramento State in the Asian American Studies program, and I'm a longtime volunteer with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. I am in charge of running a community history project that we are doing for the CHSSC this summer. We are documenting the history of Los Angeles's 5 Chinatowns in the period before 1965. And we have a group of 10 wonderful interns who we've selected, who we, through generous donations from the Chinese American community, we're able to give stipends to. They will be trained on how to do oral histories. Now what we need to do is find folks out there who have firsthand memories of LA Chinatown in the period before 1965 to be paired up with our interns and be interviewed this summer. Those interviews will be happening both in person and on Zoom. So if you happen to be an LA Chinatown, former LA resident from that has memories of the Chinese American community, you're not in LA, you can still take part. But we are very, very interested. If you know of people or if you yourself are interested, please feel free to reach out to me or to reach out to the Chinese Historical Society in general, and they can forward your information. But we have enough interns, we just don't have enough folks to interview yet. So if you know people, pass the word on. I'm not sure if I don't think I can put my actual email in the chat because I don't have that ability. But
on the website.
Oh yeah, if you find it on the website or just reach out to the CHSSC and they'll put me in contact with put you in contact with me.
Thank you, Will. And it's a very ambitious project of the Chinese Historical Society, and we're looking forward for a lot of productivity by our interns, some of whom are from UCR, some from the public history program at UC Riverside. So we're hoping to get some product out by the end of the summer. One thing I want to announce really as we close is that the Chinese Historical Society will take a little break in the summer as far as monthly programs is concerned. We will resume in the fall with a program to be announced. But in the meantime, what you can do is come to our website. There's a lot of new content that's online available in terms of history, of activities, and of just new information. We have done many interviews of people over the years, and as we're going through the process of getting permissions to have them placed online, we're beginning to place more and more of them and have more and more of them available. But the last thing I want to announce is that we have coming up in about in June 15th, I believe. Lorraine, could you put that image on the screen? Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we have an online exhibit that begins June 15th, and it is called Tyrus Wong's Murals at Grandview Gardens Restaurant. We have really two iconic parts of LA Chinatown and LA Chinese American history. Tyus Wong, the pioneering artist who worked for Disney, but who also painted and produced art for many local businesses, including the Grandview Gardens restaurant. Grandview Gardens was established in the early 1940s by, actually, there was a predecessor restaurant, I'm sorry, the original restaurant was in Old Chinatown on Alameda Street. And then with the relocation of Chinatown to our new Chinatown area, we had an opportunity for a new Grandview Gardens that was started by Doc Wong and Norman Wong, both sons of the founder of the original Grandview Gardens. In the process, we've been trying to learn more about a special piece of art, or two special pieces of art, two murals that were found that were actually placed and produced especially for Grandview Gardens restaurant. And the murals are really in the hands of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California today. The restaurant unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was a special work of art that many people remembered as they visited the restaurant as restaurant guests or as members of the family. We have been recently interviewing some of the family members, and I see both Carol and Sophia and actually Sue Fawn too, who is related to the Grandview Gardens restaurant. So we are going to have a really interesting story to share in terms of both the art as produced by an artist, and also as a backdrop to a pioneering operation in LA Chinatown. The Wong family were innovators, were creative people who went into ventures like creating Chinese frozen food or opening up a dim sum window, and just in general, bringing a contemporary take on Chinese American food to the community. So do go to our website, chssc.org, to see this online exhibit. And I should not forget to mention that this exhibit was supported by the Louis Foundation. The Louis family has been a longtime supporter of the Chinese Historical Society's programs and of community planning efforts. And I see, David, you're online. So thank you for your support for this really great project. So really, I'm exhausted tonight. I heard a lot, and I'm going to follow up on a lot of this history that I've really only heard a little bit about. So I really would like to bid goodnight to everyone. Susie, any last words? Anything else we need to say? And I would just simply like to thank everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Have a good evening.